You mentioned Jaws earlier, and it makes me think of like what Jaws does with the shark to create a monster. It feels like
Yeah,
that's what Norman Bates, as like a multiple personality,
yeah.
schizophrenic possibly
Well,
person,
that's the
they've like
thing. He's kind of a conglomeration of a bunch of different mental illnesses, which is true. Like people do have multiple, but like it was like a cherry picked. Like I'm
yeah.
gonna get every like thing I can and put it all into one person,
But they monsterfied him, right?
and then
Like
they monsterfied him.
they turned him into the monster rather than something that's more believable.
One of the things I will give him credit for is that he does seem to find some empathy for Norman. Like Norman's not. I don't know. He is the monster here, but it felt to me like he was trying to at least write with a little bit of empathy for him, empathy for the devil kind of thing. Welcome, friends, to episode 293 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And this week we discuss Robert Bloch's 1959 novel, Psycho. So shout out to all our patrons for checking us into the Bates Motel for the next couple weeks. This should be an interesting stay.
Very festive time of year for that.
Right, perfect. I think it won out over Crazy Rich Asians by a single vote. So hopefully, yeah, we can get to that eventually. But if you want to be able to vote on these things and make potentially the changing vote, the deciding vote, definitely check out our Patreon.
I would love to cover that at some point. I remember seeing the movie, enjoying it, but didn't know there was a book. Just like I didn't know there was a book of Psycho before this podcast. The movie is such a massive touchstone in horror, and it's Hitchcock, and it means so much to like there was censorship things at the time that it was paving new ground for. But I feel like that it kind of overshadows the fact that there is a book, so that's why it's great to cover something like this for the podcast.
Sure, I mean this is the perfect kind of bread and butter project for us. An iconic film adaptation that we can get into next week, but we like to on our podcast, and I think this is something that sets us apart from some other adaptation podcasts out there, is that we like to devote time to the source material whenever possible. That's going to be the focus of this episode. Is we're going to focus on the book alone. We haven't watched the movie yet. I mean, we've seen it previously, but we haven't watched the movie yet. So yeah, we're going to talk, primarily about Robert Bloch's novel, which in and of itself is also a very famous piece of work.
Wow,
But
yeah.
you're right. I mean, a lot of its fame is tied up in this film that came out shortly thereafter. It's one of those interesting ones. I almost think of it like Jaws is probably a decent comp to this, where it's like it was a big deal, but then the movie becomes just its own force that does start to overshadow it. Despite it being a really well renowned book.
Fascinating. Once we dug into this book, and I realized how much the story is just beat for beat almost. It surprised me, and I honestly think
Some
you could be
notable
forgiven.
differences, but
Some notable differences for sure, but I think you could be forgiven for being an audience member who just thought that Hitchcock wrote this on his own, and that this was his, like, because it's one of the films that people look at as like one of his masterpiece, most popular films that like I said, was like genre breaking at the time, like just for what a horror film could be. Seeing how similar it was to this source material, though, I was like, man, touching on something that would gain in popularity over a long period of time, which is the idea of like the psychological thrillers and these characters that have so much darkness in them, and they're so fascinating because there are people like this out there. And this I think eventually gets into like true crime. Like, I think if you're a fan of true crime, you're a fan of, or maybe just like serial killers in general, you're fascinated by learning about them. I think you'd probably enjoy the story and for it to be written in like the 60s, 50s.
59. So
For it to be
right on the
written
edge.
in 59, I feel like Robert Bloch may have been on the cutting edge of some of the psychological, and maybe some of the psychology doesn't even hold up today, but he seemed like he was touching in on something that was up and coming field, maybe.
Yeah, so you're touching on a bunch of stuff there that is absolutely true, and that he was like a disciple of H.P. Lovecraft. He was a horror
Wow.
writer, and we'll get into his background, but like massive fan, like corresponded with H.P. Lovecraft. He ended up like over the course of his career starting to gravitate more towards psychological horror, and thrillers and that kind of thing. I think it was just basically scarier to him. Like he felt like there was more horror in the human mind than he was finding in different speculative areas. Now, that's that to say, he still wrote a bunch of speculative stuff, which we'll touch on. But I definitely have my thoughts on this. But I'm curious before I weigh in, what were your feelings reading this book just as a book? How did you enjoy it?
That's what I did. I enjoyed it. I started it and expected it to be fairly similar to the Hitchcock story, but it sucked me in. It felt very familiar to me, but at the same time, it was this newer, fresher look at it, because I haven't ever seen this perspective, and I liked the way that it felt so modern to me. It was like, for a book that was written in 59, it felt like there's a lot of modern trappings of psychological horror, things that it's this thriller that keeps you on the edge of your seat. And I love the way that he plays with the perspectives. He has like, a scene will play out for Norman Bates, and then we'll see the actual scene from another character's perspective or something like that. And then there's kind of these moments where you're putting the pieces together, figuring out what's going on. And again, I felt like it just was a very modern story for that time period.
Yeah, interesting. You would say that it's like it does have some structural things that are definitely, I would say, on the modern side of things. It was an interesting read for sure. Sounds like you had a good time with it.
I did, yeah, I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I also found it compelling. It was a quick read. It was suspenseful throughout. I thought Bloch did an amazing job of staging everything and like expertly piecing together these pieces that he designed perfectly for this story, right? Like every character had like what you would expect for the character, but then also like something extra on top of it that made it work so well for the plot, which I'll get into. But like the whole thing with our main victim, or our first victim, Mary, where she has stolen this money, and the way that is so propulsive for how the plot plays out, that kind of moves everything forward, and like every little thing had like been, I don't know, just fit together really well, and it makes the whole story fly.
Well, and her motivation and her setup, that's a story I want to read on its own. So it's really compelling to get into her story, and then for that to be cut short is such a shocking kind of moment and thing that propels the rest of the book.
Yeah, and so I had expectations going into this book, right? Like I've seen this movie, I've seen the like newer remake of the movie. It was a long time ago. It's been a while since I've seen either. So, but I had a lot of expectations for this book going in, and I wanted to touch on like places where I was surprised, and then places where it did fit kind of what I was expecting.
Yeah, go for it.
So for surprises, I was struck by how clever the interiority was for both Norman and our other characters, where I thought Bloch did a great job of getting us in their minds, and especially with Norman, that's like such a challenge to make it feel believable. And he often did, like he did a good job of showing like a mentally ill, severely, mentally ill mind, and his relationship with his mother, and like how fucked up it is. And there's a little bit of self-awareness there, but also did a really smart job of like showing how he justifies things to himself, how he lies to himself, and sort of presenting that in the unreliable narrator sense that does feel more modern. And so I thought that was really excellently done. And I wasn't sure if we were how like well that was going to be handled, even if a lot of the mental illness side of it is definitely being sort of exoticized and played up and fictionalized in a way that in the, the years since the 60s, when, psychology has come a long way, we realize that a lot of this stuff doesn't work quite the way that these movies make it out to. Dissociative identity disorder being a main one here, where it's like for a long time this became a trope in Hollywood, where you can just kind of make it do whatever you want, and it kind of starts here, right? Like this is one of the first instances of it.
And I do think that this story does. You mentioned Jaws earlier, and it makes me think of like what Jaws does with the shark to create a monster. It feels like that's what Norman Bates, as like a multiple personality, schizophrenic possibly person.
Well, that's the thing. Like, he's kind of a conglomeration of a bunch of different mental illnesses, which is true. Like people do have multiple, but like it was like a cherry picked, like I'm going to get every like thing I can and put it all into one person.
But they monsterfied him, right?
And
like
then they monsterfied him. Yeah.
They turned him into the monster rather than something that's more believable.
One of the things I will give him credit for is that he does seem to find some empathy for Norman. Like Norman's not, I don't know, he is the monster here, but it felt to me like he was trying to at least write with a little bit of empathy for him. empathy for the devil kind of thing.
I just don't know the history of psychology well enough. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in the 70s is when like we really developed a lot of the analysis on them,
Sure.
is what I
It's like
understood.
the show Mindhunter, right? Like it shows you that they were it was still very early on in understanding these kind of people. So I I give them a little bit of forgiveness in that sense of like we just know so much more in these days about these extreme psychological states. I wasn't surprised by the transphobia that is inherent in a story like this.
Sure, yeah.
It wasn't maybe as like overt and like hitting you over the head with it as I thought it might be, but it was definitely there. Lots of fat phobia, lots of equating his physical appearance with his, evil and aberrant behavior, and that's sort of unfortunate. But I also like going in, I was like, that's kind of on the table at this point. I know it's going to be that way. I feel like we've just have moved on a little bit from this, or we should have moved on. But again, this was written in '59, so it's hard to hold it to today's standards. So I'm going to try not to do that too much.
Yeah. I also think that we may see some of that in the film as well. So that'll be interesting to
Sure.
check back in on to see like how much that was, adapted.
Overall, I had a good time with the book. It was an interesting read, and also it falls enough in line with true crime, which is something that I am very interested in, to where it definitely was evoking a lot of things I've heard about. So we'll talk about Ed Gein here, because Ed Gein is the one that I feel like for a long time heard that Norman Bates was based off of him. And I found some interesting details about why that might not quite be true. Even though, things were all happening around the same time. But we'll go with what Bloch has said himself about it.
And I think Ed Gein is talked about in Mindhunter, the show that you mentioned, which is excellent as well,
Yeah.
right? He's one of the
Yeah,
major
love
like people they talk about. So I'm just curious, like there seemed to be at least a nationwide fascination going on, especially with like how big that Ed Gein stuff would get, and then into the 70s, the study of psychology. Like I'm just so curious, like what he had access to for that time.
Yeah. So, all right, I'll just get into it. In November of 1957, so this book comes out in '59. So 2 years before it was first published, Ed Gein was arrested in his hometown of Plainfield, Wisconsin, for the murders of 2 women. When police searched his home, they found furniture, silverware, and even clothing made of human skin and body parts. Psychiatrists examining him theorized that he was trying to make a woman suit to wear so that he could pretend to be his dead mother, whom his neighbor described as a Puritan who dominated her son. So you can see how like this is pretty damn similar to what we see in the movie here. But at the time of Gein's arrest, Bloch was living 35 miles away from Plainville. Though
That's
Bloch
crazy.
Yeah, so
he was like his neighbor basically, and wrote a story similar.
yeah, so I mean, not that far away. But Bloch says that he was not aware of the Gein case at the time he began writing, with the notion that the man next door may be a monster unsuspected even in the gossip-ridden microcosm of small-town life. The novel, one of several Bloch wrote about insane killers, was almost completed when Gein and his activities were revealed. So Bloch inserted a line alluding to Gein in one of his final chapters, which I did note. Bloch was surprised years later when news of Gein's living in isolation with a religiously fanatical mother came to his attention. Bloch, quote, discovered how closely the imaginary character I'd created resembled the real Ed Gein, both in overt act and apparent motivation. So he was developing this book, and he ended up writing something quite similar, but he didn't know those details. And it kind of makes sense, because one of the things I was going to point out is that it was a little bit unrealistic in this book, is how quickly a lot of the details about exactly what went on with Norman's like state of mind like were revealed to the characters.
They got him
like,
at the station, and we questioned him, and we figured it all
immediately
out.
found out all this motivational stuff, and it's like, yeah, that works fine in a book, but like it took years for them to start to unravel what was going on, and we still don't really know.
They would have to barter with these people kind of to like get them to break into the mind of people like this. They had to like give them better treatment in some scenarios or whatever.
Well, and there
then
was
they would-
also an attitude of like not wanting to know, and just being like, these guys are just evil, lock them away, whatever. And Ed Gein is an interesting case because he was clearly mentally ill. Like he went to a mental institution immediately.
Yeah.
Like this guy was so far gone, in a way that like it almost seemed like it was based off of it too. Because in the book they're like, oh, we're not gonna hold Norman Bates to a trial at all. And I was like, really? That doesn't seem like how our justice system is done. Even if
Yeah.
someone does go to a mental institution, there's usually a trial still.
Well, and it's interesting too because as much as these people want to kind of be these individuals, and some of them want their name known and did all this other stuff, at the same time, their trends, but like, but for what they do and the things that they respond to. So, like for the Ed Gein situation, like getting information out of him to then possibly stop further occurrences of these kinds of people. It was a priority for them, I think, after that. So, like, yeah, I think it's interesting that Bloch was writing the story. That the coincidence is so crazy to me that if he didn't somewhat base it on that, it's just, stranger than
Yeah.
fiction, I guess. Like, I just can't imagine it somehow not being based on that.
There was a DVD release of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which included a little documentary called Ed Gein, the Ghoul of Plainfield. Because Ed Gein was a famous influence on Texas Chainsaw Massacre as well. And Bloch was interviewed in it about Ed Gein, and this is what he had to say. He said, it was the situation itself, a mass murderer living undetected and unsuspected in a typical small town in middle America rather than Gein himself, who sparked the storyline. He writes, thus, a real-life murderer was not the role model for my character Norman Bates. Ed Gein didn't own or operate a motel. Ed Gein didn't kill anyone in the shower. Ed Gein wasn't into taxidermy. Ed Gein didn't stuff his mother, keep her body in the house, dress in drag, or adopt an alternative personality. There were the functions and characteristics of Norman Bates, and Norman Bates didn't exist until I made him up. Out of my own imagination, I add, which is probably the reason so few offer to take showers with me. So,
That's
having a little fun with it there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if he says that that's what it was, then I guess that's what it was.
Yeah.
Again, I think it's very coincidental.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? It's one of those things, man. And honestly, it's also probably one of those things that propelled this book. We talked about with Jules Verne wrote this book that was about a guy in a hot air balloon taking this journey. And so a lot of the people at the time thought that this was like a real account of that. I don't know that necessarily people thought this was a real account of Ed Gein, but I think there was a fascination with what could possibly be going on with this kind of psychology. And then this movie and this book come out a few years after the details of Ed Gein's crimes come out to the public. So I think I bet there was a wave of fascination about it.
I can absolutely see a fascination starting there and then continuing with the movie and just, other stories like this continuing to come out. And, it's like you said before, Robert Bloch leading into writing stories like this because they are possibly more realistic than something like, a Cthulhu story written by Lovecraft. While that is terrifying and I love that kind of horror, something like this, I think maybe could have been really novel for the time, and to continue to tell those kinds of stories are like pretty terrifying. And those psychological thrillers and the ones that don't necessarily go supernatural, they can affect a lot of people and maybe even hit a broader audience in some sense.
Some people are always turned off by speculative elements.
Yeah.
It's definitely something he was aware of. Even in the book, he talks about this phenomenon of like after, there's no spoilers here. This is a very old story. But after Norman Bates is captured, he talks about how there's this fascination in the public and people wanting to come to the hotel and stay in the rooms and see what they can see. And like, it becomes almost like a tourist attraction. That literally happens with a lot of these infamous killers and, these houses where they had lots of bodies and stuff like that. And like, Bloch was touching on a very real fascination that people have with these sorts of extreme extreme situations that touch at like some of the most extreme bits of humanity that one can imagine.
It's like being interested in psychology. Like you're interested to which the depths to which the human mind will go and what someone can do.
So let's talk about Robert Bloch a little bit, since we already started to. He was born in 1917 and would die in 1994. He was an American fiction writer, primarily of crime, psychological horror, and fantasy, much of which has been dramatized for radio, cinema, and television. He wrote a relatively small amount of science fiction. His writing career lasted 60 years, including more than 30 years of television and film. He began his professional writing career immediately after graduation from high school at age 17. He is best known as the writer of Psycho, the basis for the film of the same name by Alfred Hitchcock. Bloch wrote hundreds of short stories and over 30 novels. He was a protege of H.P. Lovecraft, who was the first to seriously encourage his talent. However, he started emulating Lovecraft in his brand of cosmic horror. He later specialized in crime and horror stories, working with a more psychological approach. He was a frequent contributor to pulp magazines such as Weird Tales in his early career, and he was also a prolific screenwriter and a major contributor to science fiction fanzines and fandom in general. He won the Hugo Award for That Hellbound Train and the Bram Stoker and World Fantasy Awards. So, big genre guy in that sense. H.P. Lovecraft, who was also a frequent contributor to Weird Tales, became one of his favorite writers. The first of Lovecraft's stories he had read was Pickman's Model in Weird Tales from October of 1927, which is funny because we have covered Pickman's Model on this podcast. Yep. So I love it when all these little connections come together. Bloch wrote, quote, "In school, I was forced to squirm my way through the works of Oliver Wendell Holmes, James Lowell, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. In Pickman's Model, the ghouls ate all three. Now that, I decided, was poetic justice." So, as a teenager, Bloch wrote a fan letter to Lovecraft in 1933, asking where he could find copies of earlier stories of Lovecraft's that Bloch had missed. Lovecraft lent them to him. He also gave Bloch advice on his early fiction writing efforts, asking whether Bloch had written any weird work, and if so, whether he might see samples of it. Bloch took Lovecraft's offer in 1933, sending him 2 short items, The Gallows and Another Work whose title is unknown. So, that's this budding relationship where they're writing to each other. He's kind of acting as a mentor to him. I'm sure there's lots of racism being thrown around because it's H.P. Lovecraft, which I feel like we just have to acknowledge at any point when we talk about him.
Yeah.
Not great. He's such a controversial figure, but also so influential, and so many people who, came after him were affected by him. It is what it is when you're looking back at these historical figures. Clearly influenced, more than influenced, like offering to read his work, like that's a pretty big act of generosity, I guess, on Lovecraft's behalf.
They said protege too in that description.
Basically,
so
a protege,
pretty much his mentor.
So Lovecraft would go on to write a story where a young Bloch appears, thinly disguised as the character Robert Blake in his story The Haunter of the Dark, which is dedicated to Bloch. Bloch was the only individual to whom Lovecraft ever dedicated a story. In this story, Lovecraft kills off Robert Blake, the Bloch-based character, repaying a courtesy, quote-unquote, that Bloch had earlier paid to Lovecraft in his 1935 tale, The Shambler from the Stars, in which Lovecraft-inspired figure dies. The story goes so far as to use Bloch's then-current address in Milwaukee. Bloch later recalled, quote, "Believe me, beyond all doubt, I don't know anyone else I'd rather be killed by." So they literally killed each other in stories. So how much they were,
they love each other,
friends with each other. Yeah,
that's how they show affection.
I think it's awesome, honestly. Like I would be honored to have someone make a thinly veiled version of me and then kill him off in a story, like a friend of mine. That would be cool.
Absolutely, yeah, that's awesome.
So in 1937, Lovecraft dies, and it deeply affects Bloch, who was then only age 20. So this was all before he was age 20. He says, quote, "Part of me died with him, I guess, not only because he was not a god, but a mortal, that is true, but because he had so little recognition in his own lifetime. There were no novels or collections published, no great realization, even here in Providence, of what was lost." Elsewhere, he wrote, "The news of his fate came to me as a shattering blow, all the more because the world at large ignored his passing. Only my parents and a few correspondents seemed to sense my shock and my feeling that part of me had died with him." It does touch on the fact that Lovecraft wasn't, as renowned as he later would become, in his life, but made a big impression on Bloch as a writer. And he would go on to have this awesome career, writing all kinds of books. Like, I'm not going to list them all because there's 30, tons of short stories. He wrote screenplays, all kinds of stuff. He was involved in TV and film, super prolific.
Not knowing that this was based on a book, hearing that this author wrote Psycho, was so connected to Lovecraft, and then was so prolific. That's amazing.
Yeah, he would go on to become fascinated by these figures, and one of his fascinations was with Jack the Ripper. He wrote an entire novel from Jack the Ripper, a bunch of stories about Jack the Ripper, screenplays adapted from his work on Jack the Ripper. He became kind of an expert in him. So he was fascinated with serial killers before Psycho, and would go on. I think he wrote another novel about H.H. Holmes. So he definitely had a certain kind of thing he was interested in here, and Psycho was his most famous example of that. Now, speaking of Psycho, Bloch's agent would receive what was called a blind bid for the novel's screen rights, which eventually got up to $9,500, which Bloch accepted. Bloch had never sold a book to Hollywood before, and his contract had no bonus for the film's sale. The publisher took 15% of the contract, while the agent took 10%, and Bloch wound up with about $6,750 before taxes. Despite this, the enormous profits generated by Hitchcock's film, Bloch received no further direct compensation. Only Hitchcock's film was based on Bloch's novel. The later films in the Psycho series bear no relation to either of Bloch's sequel novels. Indeed, Bloch's proposed script for the film Psycho 2 was rejected by the studio, as there were many other submissions, and it was that he later subsequently adapted into his own sequel novel. So he would go on to write 2 more Psycho novels, but they bear no relation apparently to the sequel films that came out.
It's hard to believe that you would just say, no, you know what,
Yeah.
we're not going with the source material anymore. That's unfortunate. You know, you would have liked to think that he would made some more money off of it, but hopefully it pushed people to
don't feel too bad for him, because, you know, like what you're about to touch on, it's a huge advertisement for the book.
Sure.
Since people go out and buy it. And also, $6,750, that doesn't sound like a lot of money these days, but I put it into like a little calculator, and that was about $70,000.
Sure.
By today's money. So not bad. It's not nothing.
Then Hitchcock also, like, the legacy of the story gets to continue on in a really cool way too. To have somebody like Hitchcock adapt your work is like, you know, can't ask for more than that.
So I also saw that he wrote 3 scripts for Star Trek, the original Star Trek series, including the episodes What Are Little Girls Made Of, Wolf in the Ford, and another Jack the Ripper variant called Cat's Paw. I'm not super familiar with Star Trek, like, episode by episode, but I just thought it was funny that, you know, the guy who wrote Psycho wrote 3 screenplays for Star Trek. That's
awesome. Good for him. Yeah, I also wish that I need to go back and rewatch the original Star Trek, because you know, it's referenced often, and it's such a, you know, sci-fi pinnacle, I think. For
absolutely. Yeah, so I'm not going to go over all of his screen credits, but I noted a few on here, like Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which was a long-running TV series. He wrote episodes for that. Tales from the Dark Side, Tales of the Unexpected. He even wrote an Edgar Allan Poe adaptation for The Lighthouse, which was filmed as an episode of The Hunger in 1998. So I thought that was a little fun, you know, Edgar Allan Poe connection there, who we covered just a few projects ago. Probably
another influence on somebody like Bloch, you know, coming up. You're going to be influenced by Poe.
So yeah, he would live you know, a nice, fairly long life, die at the age of 77 after a long battle with cancer. But he released his 3rd Psycho novel with Tor called Psycho House. You know, that I think was his final novel. It does bear no relation to the film titled Psycho 3.
Yeah.
Also I saw he wrote a novelization for Twilight Zone the movie, which we covered as a little bonus episode.
Yeah.
So many weird connections to other projects we'd done that I had no idea about until I started researching this guy. Oh, he won the first ever World Fantasy Award, which was a convention I went to earlier this year. And Bloch was the first ever award recipient for that.
That's really cool.
Anyway, that's Robert Bloch. You know, influential writer, big name, but always someone who I think was equated with his most famous work. That's Psycho. And you know, a lot of that fame comes from the film that we'll get to next week.
And it's not the worst thing in the world to have a mega bestseller be adapted and that be your thing you're known for. It's like, you know, I think a lot of authors will take that.
Absolutely. And, you know, he had fans, he had plenty of readers, you know, definitely seemed like a you know, an influential writer. All right. So for the plot, Norman Bates, a middle-aged bachelor, is dominated by his mother, a mean-tempered, puritanical old woman who forbids him to have a life outside of her. They run a small motel together in the town of Fairvale, but business has suffered since the state relocated the highway. In the middle of a heated argument between them, a customer arrives, a young woman named Mary Crane. Mary is on the run after impulsively stealing $40,000 from a client of the real estate company where she works. She stole the money so that her boyfriend, Sam Loomis, can pay off his debts and they can finally get married. After checking in, she accepts Bates' invitation to have dinner with him at his house, an invitation that sends Mrs. Bates into a jealous rage. She screams, quote, "I'll kill the bitch," and Mary overhears. During dinner, Mary gently suggests that Bates put his mother in a mental institution, but he denies there's anything wrong with her. Quote, "We all go a little mad sometimes," he says, which becomes a famous quote for this book. Mary says goodnight and returns to her room, resolving to return the money so that she will not end up like Bates. Moments later, however, a figure resembling an old woman frightens Mary in the shower with a butcher knife and then beheads her.
It took me, embarrassingly, like a few pages until I remembered the connection with Norman Bates and his mother, like the actual reveal.
Yeah,
So it was funny to like get started into it. I'm like, there's something with the mom, right?
yeah.
And like as it went on, very early on, I remembered. It's a good setup. The idea, first of all, I like that we start out with a couple chapters that are like, who's you're trying to figure out who the main character is. You're trying to figure out who we should
Yeah,
buy
because
into.
you start with Norman Bates, and it seems like
Right.
he's the main character.
But then I think the
I mean,
second
yes, he
chapter,
is, but
and I think the second chapter immediately is from Mary's point of
Mary,
view,
yeah.
and that's
You're
cool.
like, oh, okay, maybe it's her.
Yeah, and so you buy into her story about like the robbery, and you're like, oh, this is cool. She did the right thing to stay with her mother, and take care of her family, and then eventually like met this guy, and he's in debt, and they want to get him out of debt. Then I'm like, oh, this is like maybe gonna be like a Bonnie and Clyde spin on this for a minute, and I'm getting bought into that. And then we get the iconic moment, which I'm happy to say is a Robert Bloch invention. The shower scene. Hitchcock just visually told it in such a striking way that it's stuck with everybody.
Yeah, we get Norman looking through the peephole,
Yeah,
and the way that the stuff with the mother is dealt with, it's really clever, honestly. And this became the blueprint going forward for people writing these kinds of stories, where he does a really good job of like, because I remembered the connection with the mother immediately and how they're the same person, right?
yeah,
Um, but you can read the book knowing that, and it still holds up.
it
And that's
does.
what
I
I think is
love
what's
it.
so clever about it.
Yeah,
Like he does a really good job of like making it to where he could say like, oh, I just felt like I couldn't stop her. I was paralyzed with fear or something.
yeah.
And you realize it's because he's like watching her, and she actually is like controlling his body. And like there were times like that where it was really clever.
And there are moments where he just straight up says like she took over and I couldn't do anything, and like
Yeah.
you're understanding that like, oh, okay, like she's physically manifesting as a personality at that point.
Yeah, I mean, and then she's also just like there in the background when he is clearly in control, but he
Hmm.
keeps hearing her, and he's like, it's almost as if she was there. I could hear her saying it, and like, it's because she is there. You know what I mean? Like, it was cleverly staged to where the first time you read it, if you've never seen the movie and you're reading this book, you don't know at first, right? Especially in 1959. So this had to be such a huge reveal, right? The
Yeah.
shocking reveal that they're the same person, and that had to be just blowing people's minds, and you can see why this made such a impact when it came out.
Alcoholism plays a big part too with some of the stuff we see, like him hitting the bottle turns into him like possibly like blacking out at times or seemingly falling asleep, like even the moment when he's looking through the peephole. I think he's been drinking, and then he like says he passes out from alcohol, and you're like, what? It didn't seem like he drank that much. And then he comes to, and then we later that I think in the next chapter we get the perspective of everything that goes down with him, like getting rid of the body, getting rid of the car, and then the cleanup, everything like that, which it's gruesome. And like, again, I don't know how normal this was for horror or thrillers for the time, like how much detail they would go into, and how gruesome it would be. I mean, I guess it wasn't like slasher, but it was like enough to I think upset people probably in 1959, if I know anything about those their moralities or whatever at the time.
There's definitely a bit of that syndrome of people make fun of the whole men writing women thing with Mary's perspective and how she's behaving. She's like checking herself out in the mirror.
Yeah,
And I feel like this is one of those times where it was done for a reason. Now maybe he does this in all his books, but like he specifically had this play out that way because Norman is watching, and we don't really know that at first when we're reading it. But he had her behaving in this way because it's supposed to like make him lose it, right? So it was done with a particular purpose in mind, but it just feels like weirdly exploitative. And again, this is the kind of thing that I'm not shocked to read about. And we still see people do this kind of stuff today. But it is definitely an example of that. Although I give it more of a pass than I would like a modern writer, whereas I feel like these days we should know better.
and at least this character does something interesting and like steals money from a bit. Like that's a
Yeah,
cool moment to have for a character, and like
yeah.
obviously eventually she's unceremoniously killed off, and it's like that big shocking thing.
It's a big shock, yeah.
Yeah, but
And we think it's the mother.
yeah,
It
and
was cleverly written where so the POV shifts to where almost omniscient when the actual attack occurs, and she sees it's like a figure wearing rouge and like the hair of the mother, and like it's written in such a way where it's like kind of ambiguous, but the first time reading it you assume it's the mother. The
Hmm.
second time reading it, you're seeing how he left some room for it to not actually be her and instead be Norman dressed as her.
At the end, from her perspective of I think the second chapter, she says she's going to give the money back. She's like, you know what, this is
Yeah,
wrong. I'm going to give the money back. I'm going to do the right thing. And then boom, it's even
yeah,
worse because then she's killed, and she doesn't get. She has to live with, or everyone else lives, knowing that she was a thief and not that she was going to then return the money.
yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, and I love that there's like unfinished business left for her, right? Because like, I mean, when people die, that's so often the case. So prior to Mary's murder, Norman had watched her through a peephole in his office as she was undressing. He was drunk and shortly passed out. Upon waking, he discovers Mary's body and suspects his mother to be the culprit. His first thought is to have her put in jail, but decides to cover for her instead. He cleans up the scene of the murder and disposes of Mary's body in her car in a sinkhole near the motel. Mary's boss, however, has enlisted the services of a private detective named Arbogast to find Mary and recover the $40,000. Arbogast has arrived at the motel and demands a meeting with Norman and his mother. The same figure of an old woman that appeared when Mary was killed in the shower appears and slices the detective's throat. Norman puts Arbogast's body in his car in the same sinkhole as he did Mary's body and the car. So let's talk about Arbogast. That's the main focus of this next section here. But I feel like you do have to mention a little bit what's going on with was it Lila and Sam. So Lila and Sam meet. Lila tells him about how her sister's missing, but at the same time, all of a sudden Arbogast shows up, and he's this like slick investigator. He's this hyper masculine, like knows what's going on, can see through people's bullshit. He's the figure that, especially readers at the time, had to expect is going to come in and get the better of Norman Bates. So again, Bloch is setting up a big surprise here because this has become more par for the course later.
Hmm.
But for the time, 1959, I think it's a bit shocking to have him go down the way he does.
Well, especially you're coming off the heels of film noir in a major way with
Yeah,
investigators and people
yeah,
solving
he's
crimes in these
cut from that cloth.
Exactly. He's that guy. And then it doesn't go he's not the hero at the end. He's not the sort of guy who sorts through the good and the bad and kind of like does his own thing. He's a loose cannon,
Yeah,
solves it at the end. He instead is like kind of a loose cannon, all of those things, but then is again unceremoniously killed, body dispatched of.
I would say his fatal flaw was that he underestimates Norman so much.
Yeah.
This is somebody he looks at and he just kind of thinks he's pitiful, doesn't see him as a threat.
Yeah. At least he snuck a
And a
phone
lot of
call.
people are that way.
Yeah, at least he snuck a phone call right before his death. That was clever.
Important bit of plot staging because we needed to get those two characters to come to the hotel, and we needed to have the next scene we're going to get into where they go and talk to the sheriff to set that up. So again, I thought this was like really cleverly like this has to happen so that I can get this thing to happen, which is exactly what I want for this plot that I've intricately crafted. And I thought, lots of credit to Bloch for doing that. And what is a pretty short novel, there's not a lot of like fat on the bone here. So meanwhile, Lila, Mary's younger sister, has become worried by the disappearance of Mary and has gone looking for her along with Sam Loomis. They, like Arbogast, managed to trace her to the Bates Motel. Lila contacts the local sheriff, who assures her that her suspicion is unfounded. He tells her that Norman is not a threat and that his mother died years earlier by poisoning herself and her lover. Lila and Sam decide to investigate for themselves. Sam tries to distract Norman while Lila looks around the house, but Norman manages to knock Sam out with a bottle. Lila finds a small, shriveled up woman and assumes it's Mrs. Bates. Upon closer examination, she discovers that it is a mummified corpse, that of Norma Bates. At that point, Norman comes up behind her dressed as in his mother's clothing and, feigning a woman's voice, announces that he is Norma Bates. He approaches Lila with a knife, but Sam, who has regained consciousness, is able to get the knife from him and contain him until he is arrested. Norman, it turns out, developed a split personality after having murdered his mother and her lover and became his mother in an alternate version of himself. Norman is declared psychotic and put in a mental institution for life. Days later, the, quote, mother personality completely takes over Bates's mind. He virtually becomes his mother. She blames Norman for the murders and resolved to stay quiet and still in order to show Norman's doctors at the institution that she, quote, wouldn't even harm a fly. That's where we end the book. One thing I'll point out is, and this summary kind of glosses over it, is there's a big climactic moment where Sam, I guess, confronts Norman that is jumped over. We get to that moment and the chapter ends, and then we get later on Lila learning about what happened and what was going on with Norman from from I think the sheriff who's telling her a report that he's heard from the psychologist,
Yeah.
and all this stuff, and then talking to Sam, and we don't see any of this actually play out. What were your thoughts on that moment? We've seen other authors do this, but what did you think of it?
Again, I just don't know how novel this is for the time. It feels like it's pretty fresh. It feels like it's he's doing something possibly newer in the way that he's playing with the perspectives and the chapters ending abruptly. I'd like that. It definitely for a story that I think if it played out just like traditionally straightforward narrative, I would have found it a little more boring, but this did keep it fresh for me.
Yeah, we see lots of overlapping scenes too, where we see a scene from one person's perspective, and then we see it from Norman's perspective too.
Yeah,
because
which is fun.
they're so dramatically different.
Yeah, I
Definitely
like that.
fun, but this was a situation where I was a little bit frustrated with shifting away from this moment. I get why authors sometimes do this. It is a little bit of a like, it's like a carrot. We kind of want to know what happened, so it keeps us reading. He's got all this stuff that he's going to reveal about what happened with Norman. Maybe you could argue this like tussle that he must have had with Sam isn't necessarily the most important thing, but like it felt like a buildup that was kind of just dropped.
Yeah.
And I was a little frustrated with it. Like I kind of wanted to see that scene.
It's interesting because it feels like Lila becomes the main character and he's like not as interested in seeing that scene, like you said. I do think that it wouldn't have been, like maybe the fight wouldn't have been as
could have just been a few paragraphs. It didn't need to be a whole chapter or anything. Just a few more paragraphs of what happened with Sam, because Norman is like coming down the stairs. He's like coming at her with, he's got the knife. He's just revealed himself. And then the chapter ends, and then everything's over.
It does feel very, very like cliffhanger-ish, but then there's no like the next episode. If you were talking,
and I thought maybe we were gonna get it as like a flashback later because he'd done all this stuff out of time, like out of order, but we don't.
No, we don't. We just kind of get it. We're just told about it. Also talking about this cop, the small town cop.
Yeah.
Man, do they make this guy look like a moron? Like,
yeah. He just wants everything to be over. Like he believes everything at face value.
Maybe there is some truthfulness to that kind of person at this time period, and maybe still is.
Yeah.
But man, if that's not like a commentary being made there, it's like this investigator is like motivated and he's clever and he's smart, and then this guy's just this is slow town, nothing happens here, man. He's like, don't worry about it, and you're like. So that can you imagine being in Lila's and Sam's situation and just being like, well, I have to take matters into my own hands now.
Right, which works perfectly for the plot. But like you're saying, like I think there is some truth to this, especially at the time, because as we've seen in the show Mindhunter, like they hadn't developed the psychology, and the FBI hadn't developed like this understanding of mass murderers and serial killers. And so a lot of these people, like these cops, have no idea what they're dealing with. They don't know how to predict it. They don't know how to see that this is even a thing that could be possible. It's one of the reasons why for a long time, it was so hard to solve these murders or to catch them while it was still happening, because it's like the hardest murders to solve are always when somebody kills a stranger. And that's what a lot of these killers are doing, because there's no like, it's not like a clear like connection between two people. Like, how do you connect these two people? And you have to be willing to entertain, these outlandish scenarios. And often back then, at least, like these guys had no idea that this was even a thing that people would do or could do.
Yeah. And then, this is time that's so far before anything like DNA and stuff. They're like looking for fingerprints and you know what I mean? They need actual physical evidence if, and then even then when they find the earring, they're like, no, it doesn't matter. Even if we bring this to the cops, they're going to find some way to say like, oh, she could have fallen. She could have done this or that. So there's so many ways, so many loopholes then. And that's why, people think that there was like this rise in serial killers. I think it was just a rise. And I don't think I've heard this from people who know better. It was more so just people becoming aware. There's always been serial killers. There's just people got away with it in the past. Or they were, maybe not like residential serial killers. There was some other facet to it.
It's changed over time, but I mean, like, it's still something that, they're still happening today. And then it's absolutely something that would happen if you're a fan of true crime enough and you listen to enough of these like podcasts or read these books, like you'll know this is something that went around a long time ago. There were serial killers, on the frontier
Yeah.
in, frontier West. Like there's people who have been doing this stuff for as long as there have been people. And like you said, it's just awareness about it.
Yeah.
And,
Well, I hear all this. One of the major ones that I just would bring attention to if people aren't aware is like Indigenous women near the Canadian border, right?
yeah,
There's like they're just like unreported, no investigations. All it's just like these horrific
yeah.
areas where these
And
people are
that could
still
be racially
operating
motivated, but it also could be like you're talking about, like a serial killer, maybe.
somewhere where people won't look or something like that. Like
Well, and
the
specifically people that
cops,
won't be investigated.
right?
Like they serial killers are very good. That's why so often sex workers are the targets, because they know that police look at that often and write it off and say, "Oh, this person was going to die any day, anyways, because of their lifestyle, what have you," and writes it off and doesn't think to make a connection and to start looking at patterns, and instead assumes it was something related to the job that got them killed. And serial killers have been doing that for a long time. So. And this is all stuff that Bloch was aware of, and like I said, like I think he had this fascination with H.H. Holmes and Jack the Ripper. So he was thinking about these figures a lot, these more historical figures, and then Ed Gein, I think, ended up becoming someone that he ended up being very familiar with and tied to because of the similarities between Norman Bates and him.
And shout out to science, right? These days we have DNA in genetic testing and things like that. That these operating serial killers, when they do crop up, some do tend to be found because of that.
Yeah, and there's some ethical valid debates about using DNA and stuff to like go back and find people, but
Well, yeah,
it's also it's hard to argue against it when someone like the Golden State Killer gets brought
exactly.
in. So,
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of other people maybe don't make as big of headlines, and you're wondering about some of this stuff. I don't know. I'm not going to get into that. That's beyond the scope of this podcast. But it was an interesting thing to think about. So yeah, I was surprised that this book had so many different POVs, that we also went omniscient at times, that it was written in this out of order sequencing, that we had overlapping scenes, that we had such crisp and interesting interiority for Norman, and for other characters. I was pretty taken with this, and surprised at how readable it was. And like you said, it did have kind of a modern feel.
You hit the nail on the head with all of that right there. That's all the things I wanted to say in wrapping up with this story is like all of those things led me to feel like this is such a modern story. And maybe this is the beginning of the trend with this author sort of being maybe the grandfather of all of this, all these thrillers that we see these days that follow these kinds of killers that are possible, these people
Yeah.
that could exist out there in some ways.
One last thing I do want to just kind of circle back to is that at the end, when the details are being revealed about what went on with Norman, a lot of this is sort of placed at the feet of being trans, and there's this like really weird thing where they start talking about like how like he was wanted to be another gender, as if this was something that like is on the level with everything else he did. Like there's a lot of equating, right? And maybe you would say like, oh, he's just laying it out that this was true. But because of the way it's being laid out in a list of other things that were like so criminal, it feels like he's saying this is somehow to blame for it, or like definitely like if you know somebody who does this, you should be worried about them. And that kind of stuff is insidious. And
Yeah.
I would think the trans community is probably not a big fan of this novel.
There's like demonizing going on with
Absolutely.
that, but and that's only a part of it as well, right? Like it's clearly a mentally ill person in addition to also maybe being trans. So there's like a lot that people may correlate with, like if you're trans you're also going to be have schizophrenia or something like that at this time. So yeah, it
it's
just
being
doesn't,
equated with a mental illness.
yeah. And
Right.
if you hold this up to like modern day, it just
Yeah.
doesn't work, obviously.
And it's definitely one of those things, man, that I think is supposed to like scare people and shock them. And when people's ways of life and identities are being used to that as like a little trick to like scare people, and it just has some unfortunate consequences in the real world. and I think we can probably circle back to that when we talk about the movie, because I'm sure it does a lot of the same, and probably has a sort of a checkered legacy with that. But from the perspective of someone who's reading this book for the podcast, you know, it's an interesting historical novel in the sense of like its place in horror, clearly extremely influential. I didn't include the quote here, but Stephen King would talk about Bloch favorably, so influential potentially to Stephen King. You know, it's a really interesting bit of horror history.
I did feel like this could be a King connection in some way. Like when I was reading it, I
obviously they were
thought of Stephen King.
contemporaries in some sense. Bloch predates him clearly, but like the later part of Bloch's career, like Stephen King is already making a name for himself. So
yeah,
you know, it wasn't like, you know, super influential in that way, but I did see it was like a line where King was giving him credit for reinventing like the anti-hero and stuff that became so popular. So I think that's where we're going to leave the book. We got a lot to talk about next week with Alfred Hitchcock, you know, a little filmmaker that you might have heard of. I honestly don't know a ton about Hitchcock. Like I know the name, I know he's foundational, but beyond that, I'm really excited to learn more about him and to learn more about this movie.
Yeah, I mean, his legacy is just so massive. Master of suspense.
Yeah.
So that's like, you know, that's a title that I don't think comes lightly, and he definitely, I think, legitimized the horror space in a way that a lot of general audiences weren't accustomed to. Like he made it more accessible, and he had some really great thriller stories, and then just the filmmaking prowess is just top notch. I mean, legendary, just like super influential for just directors going forward as well.
So excited to get into that. If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever app you chose to listen on. And if you're on YouTube, give us a like and make sure to subscribe and leave a comment below and let us know what you thought of this book, if you've read it or if you haven't read it, if it sounds interesting to you, if you think you might check it out. Love to hear that.
Yeah, leave a review of the Bates Motel. Let us know, you know, give it 5 stars, and make sure you connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. We're everywhere, so try to find us on there.
Yeah, and if you'd like to support this podcast in another way, as we mentioned before, we do have a Patreon, patreon.com/inktofilm. We have bonus episodes that we release there every month, and then you also get access to the polls that help us choose certain projects. Four times a year, we take a community poll from Patreon. So if you want to be involved with that, like choosing future projects like this one, check out Patreon. All right, so all we got left to do is to tackle Hitchcock next week. And then we're rapidly approaching the holidays here, and our Last Looks episode will be coming up. So 2023 is coming to a close. Thank you all for joining us and for sticking with us. And until next time,
keep adapting.